body has a loyalty threshold, and it is much lower than anyone wants to admit. It doesn't care that the woman folded against the base of the wine rack at 2 in the morning needs this contract. It doesn't care that Tova Lindqvist has 11 crates of Burgundy still to catalogue, that the beef tenderloin won't portion itself, or that her brother's next infusion at the clinic in Soestay. Marie is in exactly 3 weeks and costs more than most people earn in 2 months. Biology is not sympathetic to circumstance. When her knees gave out, they gave out completely, and the cold concrete floor of the East Pantry received her the way all cold things do, without complaint, without ceremony, and without letting go. She'd been awake for 22 hours. The Thane estate sat on 200 acres of shield country north of the city, the kind of property that didn't appear on any map you could pull up on your phone. The main house was stone and glass, 3 stories of deliberate severity, overlooking a frozen lake that had no name Tova had ever been given. She'd been contracted through a private catering agency for what the agency described as a 5-day engagement. Intimate dinners, 6 to 12 guests per evening, full kitchen access, generous rate, no public references required. That last detail should have been her first warning. She had taken it anyway. At 27, Tova had become fluent in the particular grammar of desperation. She knew which details to look at and which ones to let blur. She had co-signed a loan 18 months ago to pay for Don's experimental treatment. Her younger brother, 24, with an autoimmune disorder that the public system couldn't touch, and the private clinic could only manage with quarterly infusions of a biological agent that cost roughly the same as a used car. The loan had come through a private lending company with a name that sounded legal and a repayment structure that wasn't. Her monthly payment kept the interest from compounding into something unsurvivable. The principal had not moved by a single dollar. She worked 3 jobs. She was very good at all of them. The 5th evening of the contract had been a disaster that was not her fault. One of Mr. Thane's associates, a broad, sunburned man who smelled like cheap cigars and worse intentions, had overturned the entire charcuterie presentation arguing over something that had nothing to do with food. There had been shouting in 2 languages. There had been the particular silence that follows a threat being issued. The guests had cleared out by 9. The cleanup had fallen to Tova alone because the serving staff had been told to go home, and she couldn't leave the kitchen in the state it was in. At 2 in the morning, she had catalogued 9 of the 11 wine crates. She didn't remember lying down. Garrick Thane was not asleep. This was not unusual. He had averaged somewhere below 4 hours a night for the better part of a year, and he had stopped fighting it somewhere around month 3. He stood at the tall windows of his study, a glass of water going warm in his hand, watching the ice on the lake catch the clouded moonlight. He was 35, and he felt considerably older than that in the particular way that the body keeps score of things the mind has learned not to register. Tonight had been a waste. Petrov's people were encroaching on the northern distribution lines, poaching contracts that had been settled for 6 years, testing boundaries with the patience of people who thought patience made them untouchable. He had spent 3 hours making his position clear to men who didn't especially want to hear it. He had been persuasive. His ribs ached. He needed the inventory ledger from the East Pantry, the actual one, handwritten, kept in the locked cabinet beside the wine storage. His operations manager, Brandt, kept digital copies of everything, but there was a particular shipment from last quarter that Garrick wanted to cross-reference without leaving a data trail, and the physical ledger was the only place that number existed. He set his water glass down and walked. The house was quiet the way only very large houses become quiet, not absence of sound, but presence of space. His footsteps were absorbed by the runners before they could echo. He went down the back staircase, past the darkened kitchen, and shouldered open the pantry door. He stopped. His instincts, which had kept him alive through things he preferred not to catalogue, registered the body on the floor before his conscious mind did. He went still. The breathing reached him a second later, shallow, slow, deeply unconscious. Not a threat, not even close. He moved toward her. She was folded on her side, against the base of the wine rack, her dark hair escaping whatever it had been pinned into, her cheek resting on her own arm. She was in the same kitchen whites she'd arrived in 5 days ago, the ones that had started crisp and were now carrying the specific evidence of 12-hour days, a rust-colored smear near the cuff, a small burn mark on the left sleeve. Her hands were visible, resting loosely on the concrete. The knuckles of her right hand were cracked along 2 of the joints, the skin angry and peeling at the edges, the particular damage that comes from hot water and harsh soap used too often and too long. Garrick crouched down. He looked at her for a long moment. He should call the house manager. Mrs. Halverson handled the contract staff. It was not remotely appropriate for him to be in a pantry at 2 in the morning, crouching over an unconscious caterer. He had 12 other things he should be doing instead. He put his hand on her shoulder and shook her gently. She didn't move. He shook her again. Her head tilted slightly. Nothing. He looked at the wine crates, looked at the open ledger abandoned near her knee, the pen still sitting in the groove of the spine, looked at her hands again. The strange feeling that had been gathering in his chest since he walked in tightened. It wasn't pity. He didn't have the architecture for pity. It was something colder and more precise. Recognition. He knew exactly what it looked like when a body stopped taking orders. He knew the economics of it. You run the account down to 0 and then you run it further. And at some point the body simply closes the account without asking permission. She'd been awake for how long exactly? He'd watched his kitchen lights on past midnight every night this week. He should leave her. He should call Mrs. Halverson. He should get the ledger and go back upstairs. Garrick stood. He walked to the cabinet, unlocked it, took the ledger. He walked back to the pantry door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. The pantry was unheated. The concrete floor was cold enough that he could feel it through the soles of his shoes. She was a slight woman. She'd been down there long enough to be deeply asleep. He put the ledger under his arm. He walked back, crouched, and slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. He expected her to startle awake. Instead, as he straightened, she exhaled, a long, unconscious sigh, and her head settled into the space between his shoulder and his jaw with the uncomplicated trust of someone who had run out of the resources required for fear. She weighed almost nothing. That detail sat uncomfortably in his chest. She smelled like kitchen smoke, rosemary, and a faint trace of something clean and plain, hand soap from the staff bathroom. He carried her out of the pantry, through the dark kitchen, and up the main staircase. He bypassed the servant quarters. They were too small, the beds too narrow. He carried her to the nearest guest room in the north wing, kicked the door open with his foot, and laid her down on top of the coverlet. He pulled his arms back. Her fingers closed around his wrist. He went completely still. She wasn't awake. Her eyes were sealed, her breathing unchanged. But her grip was absolute. The kind of grip that has nothing to do with intention and everything to do with the body's oldest programming. Don't let go of the thing keeping you from falling. Garrick looked at her hand on his wrist. He could have broken the hold easily. It would have taken nothing. He didn't. There was an armchair in the corner of the room. He dragged it one-handed to the side of the bed and sat down. He put the ledger on the floor. He did not look at the ledger again that night. Tova woke in increments, the way you do when your body is not entirely sure it wants to give consciousness back. The first thing she noticed was warmth, the particular, dense warmth of an expensive room, the kind that doesn't let the cold in at the window seams, that has thick carpeting and a mattress with actual depth to it. The second thing she noticed was the ceiling, high, pale, with detailed plaster cornicing that was definitely not the water-stained plaster of her apartment in Sudbury. The third thing was the weight on her wrist. Tova turned her head. He was in the armchair beside the bed, long legs stretched out, head dropped back at an angle that looked genuinely uncomfortable. Garrick Thane, the man who owned this property, this silence, and the attention of a considerable number of people who were frightened of him. He was asleep. He looked, in sleep, like a very exhausted person. The severe lines of his face softened just enough to reveal what was underneath them, which was someone who hadn't stopped in a very long time. His hand was resting over hers on the coverlet. Tova looked more carefully and felt a cold drop of clarity hit her stomach. Her hand was wrapped around his wrist. She had done that. In her sleep, she had reached out and grabbed the wrist of the most dangerous man in the room, and he had stayed. She needed to fix this, carefully. She began moving her fingers very slowly, her thumb first, then her index finger, then her middle finger. She was almost free. The moment her hand began to slip from his palm, his fingers closed. Not rough, not aggressive, just certain, the way a door closing is certain. His eyes opened. They were gray, not the kind of gray that's just a washed-out blue, but actual gray with a cold, pale clarity to them, and they were entirely awake. There was no transition. He went from asleep to completely present in a single second, his gaze landing on her face with a focus that should have been alarming, and somehow, for reasons she did not want to examine, was not. Neither of them spoke. "Tova you an apology," she said. Her voice was rough with sleep. She swallowed. "I don't know how I ended up here. I was in the pantry, and She stopped. "I'm sorry for whatever my hand was doing." Something crossed his face, not amusement exactly, closer to it than she expected. You were unconscious on a concrete floor, he said. His voice was low, unhurried. I moved you. You didn't have to do that. I know. Tova waited for the rest of it. There was always a rest of it. Men like him didn't do things without a reason. They moved through the world in a series of calculated exchanges, and she had no idea what she'd just become party to. Am I fired? She asked. The grey eyes narrowed slightly. Why would you be fired? Because I fell asleep in your wine cellar, and then apparently grabbed your wrist in the night, which I can only imagine is some kind of liability. You grabbed me, he said, with the same flat neutrality he seemed to apply to everything. I stayed. That's a choice I made, not a liability you created. Tova looked at their hands. She pulled hers away, carefully, and this time he let her. She sat up. The room tilted, then steadied. She planted her feet on the floor and stood. Her vision whited out, her knees buckled. He was there before she hit anything. Both hands at her waist, solid and immediate, holding her upright with a matter-of-fact steadiness that didn't leave room for embarrassment. She pressed her palms flat against his chest to get her bearings. She could feel his ribs through the fabric of his shirt, the particular architecture of a person who didn't eat enough. Sit, he said. My contract ends today. Sit down, please. The please surprised her enough that she sat. He didn't step back. He stood in front of her with his arms crossed, looking at her with an expression she couldn't pass. Not cold, not warm, not anything she had a word for. What do I call you? He asked. She blinked. You hired me. The agency sent me a contract with a last name and a list of credentials. Tova. He repeated it, one syllable, but he said it like he was measuring something. How many hours have you worked this week, Tova? She looked at the window. Morning light was pressing through the curtains. Enough to finish what I was contracted to finish. That's not what I asked. 80, roughly. A muscle in his jaw moved. How many jobs? She met his eyes. That isn't your concern, Mr. Thane. I'm making it my concern. With respect, why? He was quiet for a moment. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the lake. The ice was white in the early light. Because I don't run a house where my staff collapse on the floor, he said, and I don't run it badly enough to need a caterer working herself into the ground to compensate for my failures. Tova stared at his back. That was not the answer she had expected. She didn't know what to do with it. He turned around. Your contract was for 5 days. It's done. But I'm extending your rate for 2 additional weeks, effective now. You don't have to work for it. You just have to stay put long enough to sleep and eat like a person. I have payments due on the 15th. She stopped herself. She didn't owe him her financial architecture. I need to keep working. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked to the door. I'll have Mrs. Halverson bring breakfast. We'll speak this afternoon. He left before she could argue. Brandt set the folder on the desk at noon. Tova Ingrid Lindqvist, he said, dropping into the chair across from Garrick. 27, lives in Sudbury. Clean record, no affiliations, no red flags, nothing that touches us. Contract caterer, high-end, good reputation. She also waitresses 3 shifts a week at a steakhouse downtown and works the overnight bake at a commercial kitchen on the edge of town. Garrick turned a page. The debt. Brandt exhaled through his nose. Younger brother, autoimmune disease, uninsured for the specific treatment. She co-signed a private loan to cover his access to a biological therapy program. The lender is a company called Meridian Capital. Looks clean on the surface, but the repayment terms are structured to make paying down the principal functionally impossible. She's been servicing interest only for 14 months. Garrick looked at the name at the top of the Meridian Capital documentation. He knew that company. He knew the man who ran it. A small, careful, cowardly man named Pryor who'd been picking off vulnerable borrowers in the Northern Corridor for 3 years, taking their income and calling it a financial product. Total? He asked. $74,000 on paper. With the rate structure, she'll still be paying in 12 years. Garrick closed the folder. He set it on the corner of his desk and looked out at the frozen lake. Buy it, he said. Brandt went still. Buy the debt. Full buyout of the loan. Today. Garrick, Pryor is not going to ask questions about why you want the paper. He's going to ask what you want from her, and I don't have a good answer for that. Tell him he's operating in my district without my permission and I'm collecting what I'm owed. He'll understand the language. Garrick stood, and when it's done, tell him if he runs another Meridian product north of the highway, he won't have a company left to run. Brandt picked up the folder slowly. He looked at his boss. Once you hold the loan, what then? I'll handle it. Garrick turned back to the window. She's a good caterer. I have a private household that needs managing. I have a new position available. There was a pause. You know, Brandt said, standing, if you wanted to extend her contract, you could have just asked. Garrick said nothing. Brandt left. She was sitting in the garden room, looking at the lake when he found her that afternoon. He sat across from her without preamble and told her what he'd done. Tova heard the words in the wrong order for a moment. Then they rearranged themselves, and the blood left her face. You bought it, she said. Yes. You can't. You don't know me. I don't have a way to pay that back. I'm not charging interest, he said. And I'm not Pryor. He put 2 pieces of paper on the coffee table between them. One was the release document from Meridian Capital, the balance stamped to 0. The other was a single-page employment offer. You said you need to work. I have a household that needs someone with access to my private floors. Kitchen, study, the north wing. The general staff doesn't go there. I need someone who knows how to be thorough and how to be quiet. The salary is 3 times your current contract rate. Tova looked at the papers. She didn't touch them. Men like you don't do this without a reason, she said. The reason is that Pryor was bleeding someone who works in my house, he said, flat and simple. I have a territorial objection to that. That's not a reason to pay off someone's debt. It is if you consider what happens to the quality of work when the person doing it is spending 70% of their mental energy calculating whether they can make rent. He looked at her steadily. You're not a security risk. You're careful, which is rarer than people understand. Tova looked at the release form. $74,000. Gone. Just like that. Like it had never been a stone tied around her throat for 14 months. What happens to Don's treatments? She asked. Something shifted in his expression, barely visible, a slight softening or the absence of a specific hardness. Who is Don? My brother. She looked at her hands. His infusions are every 3 months. The previous loan was covering the shortfall. If the principal is gone, I can afford them directly. There was a pause. Then there's your answer, he said. Tova picked up the pen. She signed before she could think herself out of it. She had weighed monsters before. She knew what the weight felt like, and she knew what the abyss on the other side of refusing looked like. This man was dangerous in ways she didn't entirely understand yet, but he was also, right now, the only reason her brother's name didn't appear in a ledger somewhere as collateral. She handed the paper back. Thank you, she said. She meant it precisely and without sentiment. He nodded once, stood and left. The weeks that followed were quieter than anything Tova had experienced in 2 years. The north wing was hers to manage each morning. The study, the private kitchen, the upstairs library, the room he used for calls he didn't want anyone near. She learned his shape through the evidence he left behind, the particular brand of black tea he drank cold, the reading glasses he shoved into couch cushions and never looked for, because he refused to admit he needed them, the way he paced when something was wrong. A slow, deliberate oval from the window to the fireplace and back, wearing a faint path in the wool carpet. She learned that he didn't eat unless someone put food in front of him. She started leaving a plate on his desk before he came in. He never acknowledged it. The plates always came back empty. One evening she was still in the study at 11 finishing the bookshelves when he walked in and stopped. He looked at her the way he always did when he caught her somewhere he hadn't expected, a beat of stillness before the adjustment. I'll finish in the morning, she said, reaching for her supplies. You don't have to go. He crossed to the desk and sat down heavily. His jacket was gone, his collar was open. There was a bruise along his jaw she hadn't seen that morning, dark enough to be fresh. She didn't ask. She went back to the bookshelves. He pulled a file open and stared at it without reading. For 20 minutes, the room held them both. The quiet scrape of cloth against the spines of old books, the occasional turn of a page from the desk that had nothing to do with actually reading. Tova had spent 2 years being invisible in other people's spaces. She knew how to be present without being intrusive. She knew how to let silence sit without filling it. When she finally finished the far wall and turned around, his head was resting on his folded arms. He was asleep. The desk lamp was shining directly into his face. Tova set her cloth down. She walked to the desk. She looked at the harsh light on his skin, the deep lines between his brows that didn't fully relax even in sleep. She reached out and switched the lamp off. The room settled into the blue-gray dark of a winter night through tall windows. She left, pulling the door quietly behind her. The next morning, there was a paper bag from a coffee roaster in Vancouver sitting on the center of the counter she'd polished the night before. The specific roaster she'd mentioned once, in passing, while explaining her flavor preferences for the kitchen order. No note. No explanation. Nothing. Tova stood there looking at it for a long moment. She put the kettle on. It was the third week when everything broke open. The weather had turned bad again, the kind of cold that shuts the lake down and presses against the windows with something like intention. Security had been doubled for 2 days without explanation. Brandt was never off his phone. The atmosphere in the house had the particular charge of a room before lightning. Tova was awake at midnight when the exterior door to the garage corridor opened. She heard it before she saw it, the dragging quality of footsteps that weren't quite right, the uneven weight distribution of someone favoring one side. She opened her door. He was halfway down the corridor when she stepped out. His shirt was dark on the left side, dark and wet, and it was spreading. Garrick. She didn't plan to use his first name. It came out before she made the choice. He stopped. His face was ash pale, the kind of pale that precedes something serious. "Go back inside," he said. She was already moving toward him. The blood had soaked through completely. When she got close enough, she could smell it. Copper and cold air, and the sharp, frightened scent of adrenaline beginning to wear off. "How bad?" Keeping her voice steady. Manageable. He wasn't steady on his feet. "Where's your kit?" A pause. "Second bathroom, under the sink." "Don't sit down yet. Can you make it to the bedroom?" Yes. He could, barely. She had taken a wilderness first aid course 3 years ago, mandatory for a remote catering contract in Muskoka that ended up not needing it. She'd spent a Saturday and a half learning wound management and pressure application and the difference between alarming and catastrophic. She had never thought she'd use it. She got the kit from under the bathroom sink and came back to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, bent forward, his forearm resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on a single point on the floor, with the concentrated attention of someone who is working very hard at not passing out. "I need to see it," she said. He reached for his shirt buttons and couldn't manage them. His hands were shaking too badly. Tova stepped in. She undid the buttons from the bottom, pushed the shirt off his shoulders, and dropped it on the floor. The wound ran horizontally across his left side, below the ribs. A laceration, not a bullet, jagged at the edges and deep enough to require more than she wanted to think about. She opened the kit with the systematic focus of someone who has learned that panic is a resource hog, and she couldn't afford it right now. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know." She cleaned it. He made a sound low in his throat, and his hand came out and gripped her shoulder. Not aggressive, not demanding, just needing something to anchor against while his body processed pain. She leaned her weight into the pressure dressing and held it, watching the clock on the nightstand, counting off the minutes. "Keep talking to me," she said. "About what?" "Anything. The first dinner. What were those men there for?" A beat. Business. That's not talking. A longer pause. Negotiating distribution agreements. Goods moving through contracts that are not always with legitimate people. And the man who knocked over my charcuterie board. Something like a breath of almost laughter escaped him. Was not happy with his margin. "And tonight." Silence. "And tonight," he said, someone was considerably less happy than that. The bleeding slowed. She sealed the laceration in sections with surgical adhesive and butterfly closures from the kit, then wrapped a pressure bandage around his torso and tied it off. She sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed until just then. She set them flat on her thighs and looked at them until they stopped. Tova. She looked up. He was looking at her, that same grey, clear attention, but something in it was different now. The architecture had shifted. She was seeing the inside of something she suspected very few people had ever been shown. "You're good at this," he said. "First aid course. Muskoka catering contract 2021. I'm not a professional." "You didn't panic." "I panicked internally. There wasn't room to do it externally." He exhaled slowly. The medication she'd pressed on him was beginning to work. She could see it in the slight loosening around his eyes, the way his shoulders dropped an inch. "You should sleep," she said. She began gathering the used supplies. "I can't." She paused. "If I close my eyes right now," he said, "the whole thing." He stopped. He pressed his mouth together. "There's no off switch. It doesn't stop." Tova looked at him. She had said those exact words to herself, in different arrangements, for the better part of 2 years. The specific insomnia of the person who is holding too much, who knows that rest is not available because rest means the weight shifts, and the weight cannot shift because you are the only thing underneath it. She knew exactly what that felt like. I have a brother, she said quietly. When he was first diagnosed, I couldn't sleep either, not really, because if I wasn't awake and calculating, it felt like I was failing him. She looked at the white bandage against his skin. My grandmother used to say, you can't pour from an empty vessel, but you can't fill a vessel that never stops moving. She paused. I thought it was a cliché. I still think it's a cliché, but she wasn't wrong. He looked at her for a long time. Lie down, she said. I'll stay. You don't have to. I know. She stood, walked to the other side of the bed, and sat on top of the coverlet, keeping careful distance from his bandaged side. I'm not going anywhere. Close your eyes. He didn't move for a moment. Then slowly, he let himself go horizontal. He hissed once when his back hit the mattress, the bandage pulling, and then he was still. His eyes stayed open for a few more seconds. Tova, he said. Still here. Don't go. She looked at his face. The dangerous man, the careful man, the man who had bought her debt and left coffee on her counter without a note. The man who had sat in a chair all night because her unconscious hand wouldn't let him leave. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Sleep, Garrick. His eyes closed. She sat in the quiet dark of the room and watched his breathing steady, the ragged, shallow rhythm of adrenaline and pain giving way, gradually to something longer and slower and real. Outside, the lake ice creaked in the cold. The security lights threw faint bars across the ceiling. She had come here for a contract. For the money, for Don, for the specific calculation of hours worked against infusions covered. She had come because she had no other viable options, and she had long ago made her peace with doing what needed to be done in places that made her uncomfortable. She had not come here for this. But somewhere between the pantry floor and this room, between the armchair and the signed paper and the coffee from Vancouver, and the 20-minute silence in the study, something had quietly, irreversibly calcified. She understood him in the way you only understand someone when you recognize the exact shape of their exhaustion. Not the surface of it, but the architecture beneath, the reason it's load-bearing, the way the whole structure would shift if you removed it without care. They were both carrying skies that didn't leave room for anything else. She reached out and very carefully rested her hand over his. He didn't wake. His fingers curled loosely around hers, the same way hers had curled around his in the guest room 3 weeks ago, without asking, without knowing, because the body understands certain things long before the mind is willing to. Tova Lindqvist sat in the dark of a room she had never expected to be in, holding the hand of a man who frightened most of the people who knew him, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, like the floor beneath her was not about to give way. She didn't want to leave. She tucked that fact somewhere quiet inside her and kept watch until morning came.